The Arctic coastline is collapsing into the ocean, carrying carbon that has been frozen underground for thousands of years. Scientists have worried about what happens next. If microbes consume that ancient material and turn it into carbon dioxide or methane, thawing permafrost could create another feedback that accelerates warming. But sediment cores collected off a Canadian Arctic island have revealed an unexpected twist. Most of the ancient carbon reaching the seabed appears to stay there. Researchers found that microorganisms converted only around 10% of the organic carbon in the sediments into gases that could eventually reach the atmosphere. Much of the rest remained buried below the seafloor. Even stranger, the microbes seem to prefer younger carbon produced in the ocean over the ancient material arriving from permafrost. To understand why this matters, begin with what is hidden beneath the Arctic landscape. Permafrost is ground that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years, but some Arctic permafrost has remained frozen for thousands of years. Inside it are enormous quantities of dead plant material and other organic matter that never fully decomposed because the ground was too cold. Arctic terrestrial permafrost ecosystems contain roughly 1,300 gigatons of organic carbon. Another approximately 400 gigatons are stored in ocean sediments and river deltas. A gigaton is 1 billion tons, so the Arctic contains a carbon reservoir vastly larger than anything humans could physically see as one object. Much of it was accumulated slowly as plants absorbed carbon dioxide, died, became buried, and then froze. Cold temperatures effectively locked that organic material inside a planetary freezer. Now the freezer is warming. As permafrost thaws, microbes on land can begin decomposing previously frozen organic matter. But another pathway begins where frozen coastlines meet the sea. Along many Arctic shores, permafrost forms cliffs directly beside the ocean. Waves attack their bases. Summer warmth thaws the frozen sediment, and entire sections can collapse. Mud, ice, ancient plants, and organic carbon then enter coastal water. Researchers estimate that as much as 0.02 gigatons of permafrost-derived carbon may currently enter the ocean each year, and projections suggest this flow could rise substantially by the end of the century. For climate scientists, the crucial question is not simply how much carbon leaves the land. It is what happens to that carbon afterward. Imagine a block of ancient soil falling from a frozen cliff into the Arctic Ocean. The carbon inside it now has several possible futures. It might dissolve into seawater. It might be eaten by microorganisms. Microbes could convert it into carbon dioxide or methane. Currents could transport it elsewhere, or the particles could sink and become buried in marine sediment. Those pathways lead to very different climate outcomes. Carbon converted into greenhouse gases can potentially return to the atmosphere and contribute to warming. Carbon buried in sediment may remain isolated for much longer. Until now, scientists had relatively limited direct evidence for how these pathways were divided in nearshore Arctic environments. The new study focused on Qikqtarjuq, also known as Herschel Island, off the northern coast of Canada. This island sits beside the Beaufort Sea and contains permafrost coastlines undergoing active erosion. Researchers collected sediment cores at different locations offshore. These cores contained material deposited over roughly the previous 50 years. A sediment core is effectively a vertical timeline. Material reaching the seabed accumulates layer by layer. Newer sediment lies near the top, while older deposits are buried below. But simply finding carbon in the sediment was not enough. Scientists needed to determine where it came from and whether microbes had already consumed it. For that, they turned to carbon isotopes. Carbon occurs naturally in several isotopic forms. Two of the most useful for this research are carbon-13 and carbon-14. Carbon-13 helped researchers distinguish between material originating on land and material produced in the marine environment. Carbon-14 provided information about age, allowing the team to separate ancient permafrost carbon from younger organic materials such as recently produced algae. The researchers also examined pore water. Marine sediment may look solid, but tiny spaces exist between its particles. Those spaces contain water. When microorganisms consume organic carbon inside sediment, they produce dissolved inorganic carbon through respiration. Some of that accumulates in this pore water. By measuring its concentration and isotopic composition, researchers could reconstruct not only how much carbon had been broken down, but what type of carbon the microbes were eating. The result challenged a simple assumption. The bacteria were not consuming every available carbon source equally. They behaved more like selective diners. Researchers described them as gourmet bacteria because they apparently preferred fresh marine carbon, such as relatively recent algal remains, over the much older organic carbon eroded from permafrost. That preference had a major consequence. Although large quantities of terrestrial organic carbon reached the coastal seabed, only around 10% of the sedimentary organic carbon was converted by microorganisms into gases that could move upward through the water and potentially enter the atmosphere. The majority remained stored in the seabed. Why would microbes ignore a giant supply of carbon sitting directly around them? Age alone is not necessarily the reason. Old organic carbon can still be usable. The important factor is chemical quality. Fresh algae can contain relatively accessible compounds that microorganisms can break apart efficiently. Ancient terrestrial organic matter may contain molecules that are chemically more complex, bound to minerals, or otherwise difficult to digest. To a microbe, two pieces of carbon are not automatically equivalent. One may be an easy meal. The other may require too much energy to process. This creates a surprising natural barrier between thawing permafrost and the atmosphere. Coastal erosion can release the ancient carbon, the ocean can transport it. But if microorganisms do not efficiently decompose it before burial, much of that material may simply become incorporated into marine sediment again. Carbon that spent thousands of years frozen on land can effectively move from one storage system into another, from permafrost to seabed. That is encouraging compared with the most extreme possibility, but the researchers emphasize an important uncertainty. Some permafrost carbon may already decompose before it reaches the location where it is finally buried. It can be processed while the coastline is eroding, while particles move through shallow water, or during transport toward the sediment sites. The new result, therefore, does not mean that 90% of all carbon released from Arctic permafrost everywhere is permanently locked away. It describes what the researchers found in the nearshore sediments they studied around Herschel Island. Different Arctic coastlines may behave differently. Some receive more river water. Some erode faster. Some have different sediments, temperatures, oxygen conditions, microbial communities, and ocean currents. Researchers will need observations across a much larger part of the Arctic before they can calculate the global effect accurately. But carbon dioxide and methane are not the only consequences of collapsing permafrost coastlines. The material can transform the coastal ecosystem even when most of its carbon never reaches the atmosphere. When frozen cliffs collapse, particles enter the water and make it cloudy. Dissolved organic material can also darken the water. Both reduce the amount of sunlight penetrating into the coastal ocean. That matters because phytoplankton and other microscopic algae need sunlight for photosynthesis. Less light can mean less primary production, and primary production forms the base of food webs supporting fish, crustaceans, seals, and ultimately people living in Arctic coastal communities. So a process can be less dangerous for atmospheric greenhouse gases than feared while still creating serious ecological changes. This is one of the recurring lessons of Earth science. Carbon rarely follows one simple path. Something released from thawing land can become food, dissolved material, greenhouse gas, suspended sediment, or buried carbon. Which pathway dominates determines what happens next. Researchers plan to investigate these connections further during the Arctic Pulse campaign in 2027 using the Polarstern Research Icebreaker aircraft and land-based measurements to study rapidly changing Arctic ecosystems. The new findings also give climate models something they have been missing. Models attempting to predict the permafrost carbon feedback need to know not only how much frozen carbon is released, but what fraction actually becomes carbon dioxide or methane. Treating every ton of eroded permafrost carbon as if it eventually enters the atmosphere would exaggerate the warming effect. Assuming all of it is safely buried would underestimate it. The real answer depends on the journey. At Herschel Island, scientists have now followed that journey into the seabed and found an unexpected bottleneck. Ancient carbon is escaping frozen Arctic ground. Coastlines are carrying it into the ocean, but when it reaches the seafloor, many microbes appear to choose something else for dinner, and because of that microscopic preference, much of a carbon reservoir that looked destined to re-enter the atmosphere may instead be buried beneath the Arctic Ocean.